So there are concerns about some of the effects of globalization, but the evidence is pretty clear that as the world has embraced globalization and selling goods overseas, investing across borders, incomes have expanded rapidly. You can think of individual nations. As individual nations have turned toward international trade and have not restricted themselves, their incomes have grown as well. There's a lot of evidence for this. And in particular, real income per person, if you think of this process starting way back in the very beginning, early 1800s, real income per person is about 10 times higher than it was 200 years ago. So that is a large amount of growth. And along with this, we can graph this per capita income. Now there's a hockey stick graph that's out there related to global warming. There's another hockey stick that relates to per capita incomes worldwide over the very long term. So I'm trying to, this is one piece, this is a piece of the hockey stick that's bending upwards. But if you consider per capita income, here's a stylized graph from the year 0 up till modern times. There was very little economic growth until you get past the year 1800. And this, again, is a stylized graph summarizing some key data from an economist named Angus Madison. But he actually picks 1820 as a year of takeoff in industrialization and globalization, and leading to substantial growth ever since that time. Now that is an interesting year to us here at BYU. And prophets have actually mentioned that the restoration not only brought knowledge of spiritual things and the establishment of the church, but also brought new ideas and technological progress. Joseph F. Smith in particular talks about this. Angus Madison's not a member of our church, but 1820 is a year of takeoff for growth, and per capita income then starts to climb significantly after being flat as far back as we can see in history. And then that next graph is more details on what's happened since 1820. But again, per capita incomes in real terms now, so correcting for increases in prices, which have gone along with output, and also correcting for price differences across countries, we get much higher real incomes on the order of 10 times higher today. So that's the details since 1820. And per capita income around the world, translated to dollars, corrected for inflation, is $14,000. And it was well under $2,000 before this whole process began. Now, as I say, this was driven mostly by trading goods and international investment. Migration has not played a key part in it, and we'll say more about the restrictions relating to that. But the fraction of people in poverty has also come down along with this massive growth. So one inevitable result of growth, and this relates to the theme of the talk series, is everywhere we've seen significant growth, we have seen increased income inequality. And from the economist's point of view, the key reason for that is that in order to grow, you have to invest. You have to invest in new processes, in developing new products, and figuring out new, easier ways to make old products, boosting productivity in farming. That requires accumulating resources and then investing in new products. That process of accumulating capital and then investing naturally is going to lead to some people becoming very rich, along with the other effects of that investment. And so this leads to higher income inequality. Now that's, so that's one thing that indeed has happened along with globalization, is a much higher amount of income inequality. But at the same time, there's been a reduction in poverty. So while on the one hand, we have some people becoming very rich, we have others who are not quite as poor as they were, and that obviously is a good thing, even though the inequality may be expanding. So when it comes to inequality, though, I think it's important to think about how you measure that. So I'm gonna do a little aside on this concept of inequality. There are various ways to measure it. The standard way is to look at income. Sorry, again, I wish I had a better touch on the remote. Okay. So next slide, please. I guess we'll try that. There's not a way up here to do it. Thank you for your patience. Well, okay, I'll just keep talking and we'll see what we get. Yeah, question? Okay, so you're saying back in the day, so we have low estimates of per capita income 200 years ago. I guess one point you're making is that doesn't seem like that, well, doesn't seem like they were in as much poverty as we might think, because they were self-sufficient in various ways and didn't have to generate income to go purchase things. Yeah, so that's true. But even accounting for that, the living standards, 200 years ago are just much, much lower than today. But yes, it's a good point. It kind of mitigates the amount of true economic growth that has occurred since that time, but it is massive. The living standards are just much higher today. So looks like I'll just keep talking. So when it comes to inequality, yeah, typically we measure it in terms of income, but there are other ways to measure inequality. Another one that economists like to look at is consumption. So we're not looking just at what people earn, but at what they actually spend. And consumption inequality is always lower than income inequality. In other words, consumption is more equally distributed because people with low amounts of income often are getting extra resources apart from income to help them live. These resources often come from family members, but they might come from government aid programs as well. So people at the lower end of the income scale are usually consuming above that income because of aid in addition to their income. And on the top end, people that have high incomes are consuming less than they're earning. I mean, you can't spend more than probably $1 million a year in any real valuable sense. I mean, you can buy up assets, but in terms of your living standard and things that actually benefit your life, higher income people have a lower consumption. So consumption tends to be more equally distributed than income. So that's one thing to keep in mind when we're analyzing inequality. Another aspect of economic well-being that sometimes we ignore is time. Time is a resource, and we may not be using it to earn income. We may be using it for leisure, using it to serve others, family time. That is completely equally distributed, but it's also a very valuable resource. And so equality of economic opportunity depends both on consumption and time, most economists would say, and those things are more equally distributed than pure income. And it's also the case that, well, different countries, have different amounts of working hours. And so some countries may seem richer, but they're also working harder. And if you're working harder to get that extra money, it's in some sense, you're not as well off economically because of the reduction in leisure time. So that's an aside on income inequality that I wanted to present to you. But in globalization, I talked about migration not being as prominent, and it really hasn't been. But nonetheless, migration has opened up in the past 100 years or so. In fact, it really started to open up in the 1800s, and there was a wave of large amounts of migration globally from about 1870 to World War I. And then the two world wars and the Great Depression shut down migration like it shut down many other things. And then it expanded once again after World War II. So there's been a fair amount, fairly large increase in migration since World War II, even though the extent of globalization in that aspect is much less than with goods and with capital. So, and with this small amount, relatively small amount of opening and migration, we've seen a lot of gains. So one way to measure the gains from migration is to consider the fact that when people migrate, one of the things they often do is send back remittances to their home nation. And that's often a big motivator for migrants. So a lot of people will come to the US, work on the farms, and send a lot of money back to family back in Central America or Mexico. And this is true of various other jobs in various other countries. Remittances are very large worldwide. And in fact, they are at least 3 times higher than foreign aid every year. These are private transfers of money by migrants back to their families at home. And foreign aid, you know, depending on how you measure it, could be a couple $100 billion a year. Remittances are at least $600 billion a year, probably more. And so here we're seeing now that migration can indeed start to have an effect on poverty through remittances. And it has enabled many people to emerge from poverty through that channel. And remittances also are probably a more efficient way to help the poor than foreign aid. I only say that, I'm not saying that foreign aid is, you know, wrong or inefficient in some fundamental sense, but it's driven by politics. And much of foreign aid is actually related to strategic concerns. So Israel is one of the leading recipients of US foreign aid. Now you can break that down into actual assistance for the poor versus general foreign aid. But remittances through even the limited migration that we have been substantial. And then you can compare remittances to the benefits of other development type projects, or you can compare the ability for migrants to earn money and how much that does to their income compared to alternative ways to boost their income. So Lant Pritchett is a member of our church, prominent economist. He's done some research on the ability of migrants to earn money overseas and compared that to microcredit and returns from that. So microcredit's a prominent way in which people have come together to help the poor by a group of donors will put funds together, and then loans will be made to people in poor areas to build their own businesses, to invest in boosting their incomes. Standard returns on a microcredit loan are about 15 to 20%, and that's a nice, healthy return for someone who's living in poverty overseas. Migrants, though, can often earn 5 to 8 times more than they would earn in their home nation. And even correcting for inflation and cost of living, they can earn 3 or 4 times more than they would at home. And if you work for a year, earning triple your salary, that is a much higher return than a 15% return on microcredit for a lifetime. So 15% for a lifetime is substantial. It's great. It illustrates the success of microcredit, but the ability to actually work at a wage that's multiple times your home wage. And this is a reality for many migrants, not all. That illustrates the potential gains from migration and the ability of migration to reduce poverty. Are we going to have access to these or? Okay. And then another way we can consider how migration might affect poverty compared to other options of reducing poverty is to look at development projects. The MIT Poverty Lab is prominent in testing out different ways to boost income for the poor. Another study by Pritchett analyzes the gains from migration compared to the best development projects coming out of MIT, and finds that these gains are probably twice what the best projects are doing in terms of boost to annual income. And we're just talking about income here. Now, these development projects have other benefits. but just to give you a sense for the potential power of migration to reduce poverty. So because it's still restricted, though, it does remain the final frontier of globalization, not fully explored. And we continue to have these high barriers, leading to, of course, a lot of illegal immigration or irregular immigration. Not going to focus on that today, just going to talk about the effects of the barriers. One form of barrier, of course, is walls and then patrolling the border. But another form of barrier is having a complicated procedure for actually becoming a legal citizen or employee of the country. Okay, if you want to get a green card in the US, just follow this very simple flow chart and it's a piece of cake. All right, this is how you get a green card in the US. It's actually very hard to read. That's part of the point I'm making here. Not high resolution. You can actually get a high resolution look at this and figure things out. And people do figure it out, it does happen. But this is another way in which barriers are imposed by having an extensive process for becoming a citizen. Now, there are definitely good political reasons for doing that. Nations will continue to do that, I'm sure, but it is a barrier. So when we think about this, then we say that, all right, there's some migration that's occurred. This has led to gains, but in general, these barriers are likely to be reducing global living standards by a lot. And that's some of the research that I've done, sheds light on some of those gains. And I want to just talk about a bit the forces behind the potential gains that might result from having freer migration. First of all, I think about how we earn money. Well, you can ask for money, money please, or you can strive to earn it. And the way we earn it is by exerting effort and having skills, and then working in a productive environment that allows us to earn our keep, allows us to produce things that cause people to want to pay us for it. So with those factors in place, one of the key facts about the world is that there are huge differences in national productivities around the world. So the environment in which people are working. So people with the very same effort and very same skills can earn very widely different incomes just because of the environment in which they work. Or in other words, the nation in which they work may be highly unproductive, or the nation in which they work may be highly productive. And people in the productive nations are typically going to earn 3, 4, 5 times more for the very same effort and skills. And there's a lot of research which seems to back that up. You could divide the world up into these two communities. One community where per capita income is about $20,000 or more in real terms, and the other one where it's below. About 80% of the world lives in a nation where per capita income is below $20,000, and therefore it's relatively unproductive. Per capita income is a rough but surprisingly accurate measure of overall productivity for a nation. And so what we have here is a situation in which 80% of God's children on earth are in lower productivity nations. Obviously, there's a wide range of incomes within that group, but 20% of us are in highly productive nations. And that leads to large income gaps, but it also is going to reduce total output in the world as a whole. When you have a lot of people kind of bunched into low productivity areas, and not so many people enjoying high productivity areas, that actually shrinks global GDP because you got too many people kind of chasing around jobs in lower productivity areas. And you have high productivity regions that could benefit from more, that could absorb more workers and produce more, but can't because we have these migration barriers. And that's the kind of the intuition for why they might shrink the economic pie by a lot. I'll show you some estimates. So as we think about, where are these boundaries? What are the rich regions? Well, basically US, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe. Those are covering the rich areas. Now, definitely we have middle-class countries, and we have, Russia in the middle, we got China moving in the middle class. Much of South America is moving that direction, but there's not a whole lot of countries, not a whole lot of people that are in those richer areas. This is a map about freedom. So I'm sorry, ignore the colors, although you can enjoy the colors. It talks about freedom. This is not telling you who's open and who's not. It's just my map that I threw into the slides. But yeah, it's It's just a few countries that are highly productive. Japan. If you try to estimate, okay, what would happen? Imagine there's no countries. Okay, so John Lennon wanted us to imagine that. If you just kind of imagine that there really are no boundaries at all, and if everyone in the world could just move wherever they wanted freely, and somehow society worked and things didn't collapse, what would happen to global GDP if we allowed that to happen? These are some estimates of what would happen. And these are massive gains to global GDP. It's a bunch of different studies using a bunch of different methodologies. And mine is different from all the others. Kennan is different from all the others. Hamilton and Wally and Iraqi are similar, but different. And what we get is potentially 40 to 50% higher, or maybe even doubling of world GDP. Moses and Letness has a wide range depending on assumptions you make. The one lower end on this is Dokir et al. Again, these are just technical studies. They're assuming that not everyone would move even if they could. Of course, not everyone would, that's true. But most of these studies, and you can do surveys kind of back this up, assume that if someone could move and earn 4 times or 3 times what they would at home, most assume that a lot of them would move, but not all. Dokir et al. Assume it's a much smaller fraction that would actually move. So they're on the low end, but even 7 to 17% boost to world GDP is huge. Okay, that's huge. The gains from further opening of trade, and we're still working on that. There's a lot of gains to be had. Again, this is just overall gains. There are losers from this, are on the order of 1 to 2%. The projected gains from more investment would be, maybe 5% or so, but these are very large numbers. So the potential gains in an imaginary world of free migration are large, which means that the current regime is shrinking GDP, and it's also increasing poverty and global inequality. And so the poor, again, they are bunched together in the lower income regions. They're earning less. The rich are going to be earning probably more because of these barriers, but maybe not. That's an open question. But it's certainly very likely to increase income inequality as well as poverty. So my research is focused on the poverty aspect of this. This is just talking about overall gains, but what I've tried to do, which surprisingly little research has been done on this, is to look at the poverty effects of these migration barriers. How much does poverty change? So you got to change the modeling to allow for people that have low skills and are kind of laboring in poverty versus others that aren't. And so I introduce a continuous distribution of skills across the workforce. And so the people at the low end are trying to get out of poverty, but can't often. And so what does migration do to the fraction in poverty? And so that's what I've tried to focus on. So my estimates, I know I'm coming up against the time allotted, but my estimates are on the order of migration barriers in place now, increasing global poverty by about 40 to 67%. So if there's 1 billion people in poverty now, the implication there is there would be maybe 700 million, 600 to 700 million people in poverty without the barriers. So migration isn't going to solve poverty, but you would reduce the number of people in poverty by on the order of 300 to 400 million people if we let all migrants go wherever they wanted, which of course is not politically in the offing, but it's an illustration of the magnitude of the effects of these barriers on poverty. Now, you of course want to know all the math behind these results, right? Yeah. Well, okay, we're not going to dwell on that, but I'm going to skip the modeling elements, but I'll say the economists estimate these things by making an assumption about production and then introducing an equation to capture that, and then changing production and incomes based on what happens as people move around between different countries. So we'll skip all that, but in my model, we get down to, again, so the key numbers here, world GDP, as I said, that would go from, there's a number of different assumptions here. You can estimate the cost of moving between $10,000 and $20,000, but it doesn't seem to matter for world GDP. $74 trillion to $130 trillion. So that's a boost of $56 trillion or 75%. If we let people go and work in more productive areas. And this takes account of the crowding that would occur in the high productive areas. It takes account of all of that. It's just a huge boost to outcome. And then on the poverty side, depending on the costs of migration, here it does matter. If migration costs a lot, $20,000 per person, you'd still let the movement happen. Not everyone would move, but you could reduce poverty by 40%, maybe even more if the migration costs are less. You can reduce poverty by perhaps 2/3 by allowing freer migration. Okay, I guess I need to wrap it up pretty quick here, but I will say that allowing migration does allow people to pursue their interest and unleash their productive potential in ways that they often won't be able to do in their home nation. And so there's a couple of examples here. I guess we'll wrap it up with this. Lena of the Philippines. This captures what we're trying to model in the economics, the payoff to being able to move. So her dad was a farmer. They had 9 kids. I figured if I could come here, I could help earn a little bit of money to give to them. This is the remittances. And this is a way that people do emerge from poverty. So that's what I did. In my country, you don't get a job unless you have a degree. You can work in a factory, but 6 months, you're gone. The job opportunities are much more fortunate here. Lena of the Philippines, Chak Bay of Malaysia. In the time in Malaysia, it was just $2 a day for 8 hours of work where I was working, pennies and cents for our work. The situation was hopeless for young people at the time. People who wanted to be educated had to leave the country and pursue their career. I came to the US for more opportunities and more fairness. I like the challenge to make a business thrive. Is a challenge, that's America. So that's illustrating the gains from migration, but there is opposition. I guess I'm up against my time, so I will end it there. I'm happy to kind of talk about, potential downsides to this, but love to hear your questions and discuss this further.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Bradford. If you could join me in an initial thank you, that would be great. We do have 20 minutes for questions and comments. And if you have a question, if you would just come up and use the mic, please, so that it gets into our recording, that would be great. Professor Bradford, you are welcome to take one question at a time or bundle them in a couple of, to get as many questions as we can in the allotted time. So I'm just going to ask one as a thought starter, and then please, for all those listening, please join in the discussion. And when you do come up, if you could just say your name, and if you're a student, your major or your background. My question is, given the obvious economic gains to be had globally, and that migration barriers are determined largely by rich nations, how much of that global economic gain will accrue to rich nations who open up those barriers? In other words, are they diminishing their own economic growth with those barriers? And in parallel, for poor countries that currently have very low productivity, what are the consequences for the domestic economies of those countries if the floodgates are open and large portions of capable people leave those countries? Are we relocating people away from poor regions that need development?
Thank you.
And we'll let you take your own questions.
Okay. So in the modeling I do, there's definitely a cost to the destination, the rich country. Their incomes would be reduced. Now, this isn't always going to be the case. It depends on how you model things. But in a simple setup, as you bring more migrants in, that's going to put downward pressure on wages for everyone in that country because it's going to be an integrated labor market. That's in a simple setup. And by my estimate, if we did, we do this scenario of just allowing poor people come as they wish, that would probably reduce rich country incomes by 5 or 6%, according to the modeling I have. And that may not seem like much, but that is huge, actually, politically. The recession of 2006, 2008, that that reduced income in the US by 4.5%. And that was a major stressor for Americans. But that was just a 4% average. Now, obviously, a lot of people were much worse off than that. Some were actually better off during that time. But the average reduction in income is 4 to 5%. So if you allow massive migration of the type that is being simulated here, again, not really going to happen, but it definitely would put downward pressure on the destination wages. And that obviously is part of the political opposition that we see to this. And then you're concerned about workers leaving developing countries, the so-called brain drain. And yes, there would be a tendency for better educated workers in those developing countries they would be better able to leave. They probably get a higher return from leaving. Actually, the more education you get back home, if you're doubling a higher income, then you're getting a higher payoff to leaving. So that would be a concern potentially. But there is a silver lining to that. And brain drain has been studied a lot. Actually, it's an open question. As people have migrated out of countries, and Haiti is one example where many people have migrated to the US, has that hurt Haiti? Well, in some ways, yes. But at the same time, when you consider remittances that come back and the money flows that come from those migrants, it doesn't necessarily hurt the sending nation as much as you might think. And then there's other studies of African nations. So there's it's open as to whether there's a brain drain or a brain gain, because there could be a positive payoff from even sending your best and brightest to rich countries to work. Again, the remittances come back, but that leaves more jobs open back home. So we're not saying that everyone leaves. Of course, that would be chaotic for that country. But as workers leave, and even if it's a lot of workers leaving, that's opening up jobs for the people who don't leave. And that's going to boost their wage. With fewer workers around, with them, many having moved overseas. So there is this mitigating effect that comes from workers leaving the poor countries that counters the brain drain and could actually lead to a brain gain over the longer term if a number have left, opening up job opportunities in the source nation. Then people will be motivated perhaps to get an education and fill in those jobs that were, so as doctors leave Cameroon and go to Europe, there'll be more doctors training in Cameroon to fill those jobs which are in demand. And so that would be a countervailing positive effect, potentially. And it's an open question. I think, I think there's no consensus as to whether it's brain drain or brain gain, but it's a very valid point. And obviously there are real costs to some of these potential movements that would come out of large scale migration. I will say, just one more quick comment on that. Yeah, you could imagine bringing in many, many people and you wonder, okay, that really is going to be, say in the US, if we allow about 1 million new immigrants a year. If you just ratchet up to 5 million, I mean, that seems like it's just too much for us to handle. But over the last 70 years, the population in the US has doubled over the last 70 years. So it's a longer term process. And our per capita real income, so accounting for inflation, income per person, so we got twice as many people, is up 8 times. Per capita real income is up 8 times, even as the population doubled in the US. It doesn't look like overcrowding of people is an issue for our economy. Now, there are other issues from migration, and there's things up there that people are concerned about, and there's other concerns. But I think modern economies do surprisingly well at absorbing new workers. And that's been shown over a number of different countries. Okay, any other questions?
Hi, my name is Joe. I'm a comparative studies master's student. I'm curious if something like the Eurozone can be seen as a model for the positive economic impact, or if it has been used as a model for allowing freer migration amongst several countries or a group of countries, and if that can be modeled to larger than the EU, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think I understand. The EU is a very interesting case because they do have the so-called Schengen arrangement that allows all citizens of people that have signed on to that to move freely. And this does appear to have led to substantial gains for the EU economically. Now, there are costs. There's been some political opposition, and we've seen outbreaks of concerns in various European nations. And, but as far as that agreement, I think it's been a success story for Europe. Is a highly developed, rich area, and it's interesting because there's a diversity of backgrounds and languages, and yet they've cooperated to a very large degree on migration, which is so difficult politically. And I think that's been a very interesting thing to see. But the economic benefits are clear. Can other nations learn from that? I think so, but I think it's probably things that are unique. I'm not a Europe expert. There are Europe experts in here. There are things unique to that enable that to happen. But there are very strong economic benefits from allowing this. Britain is now kind of seen as a try to implement Brexit. That's also affecting the movement of people in and out of Britain, and jobs are being affected there. I think we're seeing, that the Schengen arrangement really is a positive because Britain's now pulling out of that in some ways. I don't have any insights as to how that could be translated to other settings, but that particular arrangement has had a lot of economic payoffs. Now, with refugees, you have a different situation. And a lot of refugees, of course, have come into Europe in recent years because of Schengen. Now, it's a little different because refugees have to get registered and go through a process of legalization. But it's been easier for them to move around. That's created some conflict, actually, among European nations as to how do we handle the influx of refugees. So there are some concerns there. But I think it's a very interesting story, how the Europeans have been able to come together. And clearly there are benefits from allowing workers to move across more than one nation, especially when the nations are, while modern and developed, they're geographically small. There's a lower chance of having your best job being in the nation you happen to be in when you're in Europe. So that's had I think it's had a positive payoff, probably unique to some of the unique to the background of Europe that they were able to cooperate to that degree.
Thank you.
Good point, thanks. Okay, someone else coming up.
Hi, my name is Emily. I work at the Kennedy Center, and I've just been really intrigued by this bullet you have up on the screen about migrants, the concern that migrants drain fiscal resources, but that evidence implies the opposite. And I was wondering if you could expound on that.
Yes. So yes, there's a concern as migrants come in that they don't pay taxes, and yet they might draw down government benefits through welfare or through medical coverage. It's a bit complicated, but basically, most migrants who are coming in are young and in their early working years. Many of them are single and don't have children. That type of person does not draw down very much at all on fiscal resources. Young single workers are not drawing Social Security, they're not drawing Medicare, and they're unlikely to be drawing welfare. And they're also not, because they don't have children, are not drawing down the school resources wherever they might be living. So because of a large number of young single workers, the draw on government resources is less than we might think. But as to the extent that families are migrating, then there's going to be a drain locally, probably on school resources, at least initially, and on welfare. Welfare is administered by the states. And so you're going to more likely have people drawing on those resources, and that could be a drain in that sense. But again, to the extent that these workers most of them are not near retirement age, they're the largest government payouts in this regard. These fiscal resources spent on people are Social Security and Medicare for the older people. And so that's not really happening with immigrants. And another interesting thing is even if you're undocumented, so-called illegal immigrants, undocumented, they often are paying into the system because their employer is paying Social Security and FICA on them, even if they're not documented, because employers, they have to be careful about that. The worker themselves himself or herself may not be paying in, But employers are often paying even on the undocumented workers, and they're not drawing benefits as undocumented. So that's actually a net plus for the fiscal resources. So you can look at various aspects. Study that I trust the most finds that there's potentially a negative drain at the local level, especially to the extent that there are families involved in terms of schooling and welfare payments to families, but not at the federal level. It is not a drain on federal resources to have even undocumented workers in the country. And then you look at the second. Economists often like to look at the long run, even though we may all be dead. We still like to look at the long run. In the long run, it's very clear that migrants boost fiscal. They pay much more in taxes than they draw down. Over a 30, 40-year period, what you have are children of migrants who are born in the U.S. And most of us pay over that next 40 years before we retire are paying in much more than we're getting out. That's just standard. A lot of our payments are going to defense and not people-related things. So that's really a quick summary of the evidence. It's very hard to find evidence that migrants drain fiscal resources, even though you might think they could easily do that. It doesn't appear to be happening in the U.S.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, any other questions? There's one last, I guess I could leave it one more thought. You can jump into the question if you want, but I teach American Heritage. Sometimes these things are on my mind. There's a question, the Declaration of Independence was revolutionary in writing down the belief that there are rights that everyone has, not just for a particular country, rights that everyone has. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of course. When it comes to migration policy, there is a tendency to differentiate between people born in our country and born overseas. And one of the beliefs that leads to opposition to more migration is that we have no obligation to help people born in other nations. But does the Declaration of Independence apply everywhere? Are all of God's children endowed with the right to pursue happiness? If so, maybe that creates more of an obligation, not necessarily to throw open the borders, but to allow people who are going to be law-abiding and diligent and desire to contribute to society, to allow maybe more of them to pursue happiness in that way. Now, pursuit of happiness isn't just about money. I think it has to include virtue and doing the right thing and helping others, building up people around you. But migration barriers do undercut many people's ability to pursue happiness in that way. And so that's something I think that maybe we could think more about.
Outstanding. Please join me in saying thank you once again. Appreciate that.